Chapter 30. We're going to be talking about Haydn and the symphony in this chapter. So the symphony, you may have heard that as referred to an orchestra, the symphony, but it is actually a genre, and the genre refers to the whole orchestra playing a multi-movement piece, and it has its roots in Italian opera overture. It was considered the ultimate instrument of the classical era. So this was a very, very popular choice of music and really defined the classical era. A lot of the music that you've heard sampling of comes from either opera or probably a Haydn or Beethoven or Mozart symphony. That's just a very common thing that we tend to restate some of the melodies from there. One of the things that makes it so incredibly powerful is that you have so many different instruments to pull from. That's what that remarkable timbral palette means. Think about painting with just a few colors or painting with 80 colors. Maybe not that many, but you get the idea. It gives you a lot more creativity possibilities when you have a lot more to work with. And so they were very versatile. They could all sound very different, but depending on what music they used, how they used the expressive qualities that they were able to pull from these instruments, etc. Early on, Italian opera typically had a symphony overture. It was different than the genre classical symphony, but it was somewhat perhaps similar to the concerto in the fact that it was a 3-section piece with a fast, slow, fast pattern. We talked about that when we were talking about the concerto. Fast, slow, fast, 3 separate movements, but they all went together as a whole. And so the Italian opera overture would be this piece of music that would start before the opera actually began. Well, it kind of could stand on its own, and so people began to write these pieces and expand them and add different things to them, and so they became a genre all themselves. One of the things that you might hear referred to is something called a rocket theme, which is referring to something sounding very aggressive and rhythmic, a very quick rise from a low register to a high register. So think about a rocket taking off. So that was one of the effects that composers liked to use, and it just drew audiences in like crazy. Another effect would be the steamroller effect. Think about something flattening out slowly, 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 or rising up gradually, gradually, gradually. So these crescendos of slowly getting louder, slowly getting softer, were very, very popular with the audiences. There was also a dance movement, the minuet, added. Remember I showed you when there were 4 pieces, or excuse me, when there were 4 movements, typically that third movement was a dance movement, which would have been a minuet, most commonly always a minuet. So it would go fast. Fast movement was the first movement. The second movement would have been a slow contrasting movement. The third movement of a 4-movement piece would have been the dance movement, and then the final 4th movement would be a fast, upbeat closer of the orchestra of the 4-piece or the 4-movement piece. Let's talk just briefly, quickly about the second movement, the theme and variations. So this wasn't always a theme and variations. It was the second movement of a 4-movement work was always slow, either andante or adagio, but not always theme and variations. Typically, they would take lyrical songful melodies, and they would take that theme, state the theme, and then they would vary the theme as the theme repeated. That's the theme and variations form. Most second movements were in a ternary form. So that would have been an A statement, B contrasting musical statement, and then repeating A. So the ternary form is different than the theme and variations. Okay, so theme and variations, you hear that theme clearly stated, and then you're going to hear those variations. Usually the theme has 2 or 3 parts to it. You might vary it by adding notes, by omitting notes. You might change some chords, change the accompaniment, even shift to a different key. You could even change the rhythms. There's really so many things you could do to create a variation of that, even the texture within it with adding a counter melody. So there's lots of different ways to add that variation. The classical orchestra and symphony was considered the standard, it became the standard makeup of an orchestra. So there were 4 distinct instrument families. You've got the strings, which were still the heart of the orchestra, still are. The woodwinds, lots of different colors, tone colors in the woodwinds. And they were often doubled, the strings. This is a picture of a small orchestra in a Venetian palace in probably the 18th century. Give you an idea of the people and how they came to listen, but this is much, much smaller orchestra than what we grew to. We grew to about 30 to 40 players. So then you had, okay, strings, woodwinds, then you had the brass, and then you had the percussion. So 4 different instrument groups. 30 to 40 players in a typical 18th century orchestra, which would have been a size that fit appropriately in the salon, not the hair salon. That's a little different than the salon, but think of a salon in a palace or in a wealthy person's, maybe not quite up to the palace scale, but bigger than a home. A lot of times they would take the themes and they would interchange them between the instrument groups. It functioned a lot like chamber music, and we talked about that in the other chapter. The piece that we are going to listen to is Haydn Symphony number 94, nicknamed the Surprise Symphony. Haydn was the father of the symphony. He composed over 100 symphonies, and he established the 4-movement structure that we came to know as the symphony. That fast movement, slow movement, dance movement, fast movement, fast, slow, dance, fast. When he was a little bit older, he actually traveled to London. Remember, he was in the Prince Esterhazy Palace. And so when he went to London, he composed several symphonies that were called his London Symphonies, numbers 93 through 104. We're going to be listening to 94, so that falls in that. These are really considered his masterpieces. Lots of expressive effects, lots of crescendos, accents. You're going to hear lots of dynamics. Remember, this was somewhat of a new thing. The instruments, as they became more advanced, were able to do more dynamics. You're going to hear things like syncopation, even modulations. And this Surprise Symphony is his best known symphony. The reason why it gets its nickname is there is a sudden fortissimo chord, that means very loud, in the slow movement. And so typically the slow movement's kind of chill. And so the joke was that it would wake up the dozing audience. A lot of nice melodies in this, and he knew how to write in forms and treated them very well and really established those standard forms for the symphony. This is the Palace of Esterhazy in Hungary, where he spent so many years. So just to give you an idea, this was where he was performing a lot of his symphonies. So could you get musically creative and inspired in a place like this? All right, so take a listen to the second movement, the Andante movement, meaning it's a slower pace. It's a theme and variations form, binary structure, so you can have an A section and a B section. It's a folk-like melody. You're going to hear pizzicato strings, which means strings that are plucked instead of bowed. And then the B section is going to have a disjunct theme. But listen for that surprise chord at the end of the pianissimo. There's 4 different variations, so see if you can follow along with them. And then at the end of the variations, you'll hear a coda, which is just the return to the A section, and then it'll end kind of quietly. It doesn't have a big exit. You can always look at the listening guide here. I strongly suggest referring back to that for following along and for hints on what to listen for and when. And this will be the time progression for the listening.